He's here. So you could make him panelist as well.
Some friends that have joined us, thank you so much. Andrew, Atakan, Jessica, Josi. Josi, can you just put on your video, please? Thank you, Atakan. Hi, Kurt. Hello, Melanie. Hello, Praneet. And Wairimu. Thank you for joining us. We'll start momentarily. We're just waiting for Dr. Letlape to join us. But we want to already welcome Joseph Magero, the chairman of Campaign for Safer Alternatives in Kenya. We have 2 hours of dynamic speech on the topic of tobacco harm reduction. Josi. While we wait, I just want to, Josi, can you just switch on your video, please, bottom left?
Well, it's not there. I've only got audio controls. I don't have video, access to video. I guess I'm on a lower level.
No.
It's like I'm part of the audience, not part of the...
You should be
Now I'm promoted to a panelist.
yes.
I was before, so you'll be able to see me shortly.
Wonderful. Josi, with Madiba in the background, welcome to our forum. Joseph,
Thank
welcome.
you for the invitation, and thank you for allowing me into the meeting.
We will just wait for Solly Ratemane to join. There we go. Hello, Solly. It's a huge privilege to welcome you all to the Africa Tobacco Harm Reduction Forum. If I could just introduce you to the gentleman on the screen, Joseph Magero, Chairman of CASA, Campaign for Safe Alternatives in Kenya. He's done stellar work in both tobacco control and tobacco harm reduction in Kenya, and we look forward to hear from Joseph today on a survey which was recently completed in Kenya. Then to your bottom left, Dr. Josi Letlape, a famous South African, the former president of the World Medical Association, which is the representative body of physicians worldwide, also the president of the South African Medical Association, an ophthalmologist, and a longtime advocate in tobacco harm reduction. We look forward to hear his remarks on tobacco harm reduction in Africa. And then Professor Solomon Ratemane, he's our therapist, psychiatrist from South Africa, who's also the Secretary General of the World Association of Psychosocial Psychology and Psychiatry. We welcome him to our forum, which is dedicated to tobacco harm reduction in Africa. And maybe just a couple of remarks on the context of our discussion. We are talking about Africa, which is the world's largest continent in terms of population, 1.2 billion people. On the continent, there's a smoking prevalence of 14%. 4% of adults and many children smoke. And this is what we want to address specifically through the lens of the potential tobacco harm reduction products that are being used on the continent, specifically Kenya. So Kenya has 52 million people, and actually quite a low smoking prevalence of 10.2%. Over the last years, it's been the objective of the government to let the country go smoke-free, as it were. And over the last years, 3 main categories of reduced risk products have emerged. Number one, we've heard of the emergence of the electronic cigarettes, or otherwise called vaping products. The World Health Organization calls it electronic nicotine delivery systems, ENDS. And then a phenomenon in Kenya is the rapid increase of the use of oral nicotine pouches. These are small tea bag-like products that have no tobacco, but pure nicotine, that smokers use if they cannot or will not quit smoking. So this has become one of the reduced risk products that have been used quite regularly in Kenya. And Joseph will specifically speak to a survey done amongst 68 consumers of these products in Kenya, so that we can have a better perception or understanding of consumer perception of risk, consumer perception of product, so that we can fit that into our tobacco control strategies. With that, I would like to ask Dr. Letlapi to address us first on tobacco harm reduction and its potential use to help Africa as a continent go smoke-free. Dr. Letlapi, please.
Thank you, Dylan. And thank you for our colleagues in Kenya for the invitation to speak. I'd just like to start by saying that before I even go into harm reduction, to say, you know, people, we've got to change how we deal with each other in Africa and how authorities deal with us in Africa. And I just wrote something that says, don't tell me what to do. Just give me the information and allow me to make an informed decision. And I think if we changed our own attitudes in Africa to that, and if authorities treated us like thinking human beings, the continent will be better off. Smokers are human, and some of the brightest people I know are smokers. So they are able to make their own decisions. They are also able to know what can harm them and what cannot harm them. But unfortunately, with cigarette smoking or with nicotine, they are dependent on nicotine. But they have to be deriving some benefit from the nicotine, because they would not be, you know, that vain to continue with something that, if they continue using it for a lifetime, will kill them 50% of the time. I mean, smoking kills 1 in 2 of its users in a lifetime. So we know that smoking causes the most preventable harm to human beings in terms of its health effects. Now, the key issue is combustion. Now, if you get your nicotine through combusting cigarettes, you're getting your nicotine in an extremely effective manner, because the delivery through the lungs is quite quick, but it's also the most harmful way of getting your nicotine. Studies have been done where the total aerosol residue, when you combust tobacco, you produce over 7,000 chemicals, some of which are carcinogenic and have been recorded by the WHO, by the FDA, and many other health authorities. And we know what those carcinogens are. But the main thing is, if you combust it, you get it in that form. I also want people to be mindful of the fact that combustible cigarettes cause a lot more harm than just to the individual. In our continent, we have people that are in the lower LSMs that don't really have access to spare cash, that smoke. For those people, that expenditure is a big part of their livelihoods. They sacrifice essentials like food for smoke. They sacrifice putting food on the table for children for smoke. There are also other effects, second-hand smoke, that we know about. But there's effects on children. There's effects on stinking clothes. And all those other things we sometimes never think about. The benefits of moving from combustion to others around you. We've had a sad incident a few weeks ago in South Africa where there was a fire in one of our hospitals. Preliminary investigations have indicated that the fire may have been caused by a mental ill patient who was admitted to hospital who was smoking. So it may have been an accidental fire caused by smoking. There are a lot of felt fires that come from that. So there are other benefits besides better health benefits or reduced harm from moving from combustion. So the key issue that I want us to understand is that combusting tobacco is the most harmful way of getting your nicotine. And there are many non-combustible alternatives. Thankfully, because of the era that we live in the era of innovation, there are multiple alternatives to combustion. In medical circles, for example, knowing what Michael Russell said in 1976, that smokers are addicted to the nicotine, but they die from the tar. We have nicotine replacement therapy, which is pharmaceutical grade nicotine manufactured by pharma companies that are made available to those that don't smoke. Remember where we start when we talk about prevention. If you smoke, quit. If you can't quit, switch, because there are alternatives. I am not one that is an advocate of quit or die. I'm not evangelical on this issue. I'm just a physician. So the first message to those that smoke is quit. But we know that quitting is difficult. That's why we have over 1 billion people that still smoke on the planet, sometimes estimated as 1.3 billion. Now, if you can't quit, switch from combustible cigarettes to the alternatives that are available. Now, what is available? That is non-combustible nicotine delivery. We have smokeless tobacco, proper smokeless tobacco, where it is tobacco that you do not combust. That has been used in the continent, in our country, as snuff. That has been used in Sweden, where tobacco is put into pouches, and it's called snus. We now have nicotine pouches as well. That is proper smokeless tobacco. But you then have other ways of delivering the nicotine. So remember, smokeless tobacco is put in a pouch, it's called snus, or it's just taken as moist tobacco in Africa. It's chewed in India, but there are other ways of getting your nicotine from tobacco without combusting it. You then have nicotine pouches, which is a thing that has just started in the last 2 to 3 years that has become available over the counter. Now, this is basically pharmaceutical grade nicotine put into a pouch, mixed with salts, and that's how you get your nicotine. You just put your sachet between your gum and lip, and it stays there, not obstructive, does not harm anyone. You're not creating any secondary smoke of any nature for anybody. You can use it anywhere, and it's a good alternative to getting your nicotine. Now, what is great about snus is that it's the only product that where we have 40 years of epidemiological evidence. Even the WHO has acknowledged that. Now, the Swedes, who have been using snus for a long time, have managed to achieve what other nations dream of. You know, everybody talks about smoke-free, reducing the use of combustible cigarettes to less than 5% prevalence in your community. Sweden is there. How did they get there? Snus, the alternative to combustible cigarettes. And through that, they have the lowest incidence of tobacco use in Europe, just around 15%. But most of it is non-combustible nicotine. Only 5% of their nicotine users use combustible cigarettes. And interestingly, the prevalence of smoking combustible cigarettes is higher in females than in males in Sweden. What have they got from that? A lower disease profile than any other nation in Europe. They have the lowest incidence of smoking-related diseases, including cancers, in all of Europe. They have the lowest prevalence of smoking in their community in all of Europe. They've seen massive displacement of combustible cigarettes by non-combustible snus. What is this recent other experience that we've just seen? Japan. We've seen in Japan in the last 5 years where they've allowed the use of a heat-not-burn product. They have a few products on their market. And what has happened in the last 5 years is that they've seen the most rapid decline of smoking they have ever seen. More than 25% decline in smoking or in sales of cigarette sticks in the last 5 years. It's been displaced by heat-not-burn products. They now occupy almost 30% of the market. But what have the Japanese seen in this period is that the prevalence of smoking, it's going down, it's not going up. So these alternatives are cannibalizing the market for cigarettes. They are replacing smoking, but the population trend is still going down. So it's not like there's a gateway and there's now an upswing in the number of people that use nicotine in Japan. Thankfully, you see a decline in that respect as well. Now, here's what is interesting. The WHO, in its strategy in the FCTC, includes harm reduction. But they now seem to be the advocates of being anti-tobacco harm reduction. And the effect is that it looks like those that were good for tobacco control, good for improving health, are now protecting the cigarette market. Whether it is deliberate or inadvertent, I don't know. We've seen in most environments during the COVID period, when alternatives were not readily available, people relapsed into smoking. Smoking rates are going up. So in actual fact, one of the things we've learned in the pandemic is that there's a duty for governments and society to make risk-reduced products available to those that cannot quit. In most of Africa, we can't really talk about access to cessation clinics. In South Africa, the last time I counted, there was one in Cape Town, and there are a few that are sort of coming up in Gauteng. But really, in the state, we do not offer cessation clinics. There's a network from the Council Against Smoking where people are assisted to quit, but the failure rate is high. The relapse rate is quite high in smoking. So we have a duty to ensure that alternatives are available to smokers. It is an ethical duty of governments to make those alternatives available, not to come up with pieces of legislation that ban products. Now, when I started talking, I spoke about the issue of competition on people's wallets in terms of the costs of tobacco and related products. One thing that we should not allow is to have governments impose restrictions that make the alternatives more expensive than combustible cigarettes. We have to ensure that the cigarette price becomes the reference point, and the alternatives should be available at prices below the price of combustible cigarettes. People need to remember, when we're talking harm reduction, we are not talking no harm. We are saying harm is reduced. You know, we see some interesting things, and Africa needs to rise to be able to use what God has given us between our ears. We need to start thinking for ourselves. You know, we look up to the WHO like we're looking up to a God. But when you look at other nations, they make their own decisions. Despite the rhetoric that comes from the WHO about e-cigarettes, where they basically are encouraging governments to ban e-cigarettes. You look at the UK, they've embraced e-cigarettes. They are providing them in the national health system. They are being provided in their cessation clinics. Look at the wonder of what has happened in Sweden. Norway has adopted that. Finland is beginning to. So when you look at other governments, they don't lose their independence. They look at information, they assess what's happening in their societies, and they make informed decisions. Look at the US. The US has just given approval to the heat-not-burn technology of PMI called IQOS to make a reduced exposure claim. What studies have shown is that the total aerosol residue that is produced from the heat-not-burn product called IQOS produces much less harmful chemicals than the combustible cigarettes. Some, like carbon monoxide, are eliminated. Others are reduced to the magnitudes of 90 to 95% less. So they've been allowed to make a claim of reduced exposure. They are creating a framework for these products to be licensed, to be regulated, but they are being made available to society. Now, one of the big problems that we face globally is the issue of tax. Now, I have said this before, that when we talk about nicotine and addiction, it's created other addicts. You see, the smoker is addicted to the nicotine. The industry is addicted to the profits. And the government are addicted to the taxes that they derive from combustible cigarettes. And you see now globally, there's a problem where as you have less harmful products being introduced, governments feel harmed by the fact that revenue is going down. And they are coming up with unreasonable tax regimens on the alternatives to combustible cigarettes. We need to stand up, advise, and engage as health activists. You cannot make the less harmful product not affordable. It is criminal to do that. And governments, you hear people talk about, those that are in tobacco farming should be encouraged to look at other crops to produce. We should be telling governments to look at other revenue streams, but they are addicted to the revenues from tobacco, what is commonly known as a sin tax globally. So we just need to ensure that the alternatives are made available, that countries regulate these products so that society is protected, so that we know that we're getting safe products. Now, a lot of the alternatives, or a fair amount of the alternatives, are electronic products. For Africa, that poses a bit of a challenge. Because in our country, the near 900 or between 800 and 1,000 rands that you need to invest for a device is not accessible for most smokers that are from the lower LSMs. We have a grant, a support grant of 350 rands a month. So you need to save your grant for 3 months just to be able to buy a device. So it is clearly not affordable. Now, smokeless tobacco has been used in the continent for years. Snus, or tobacco in pouches, is affordable. Let us make it available for our societies. Let us educate people about the harmful effects, that the most harmful way to get your nicotine is through combustion. If you have to have your nicotine, take it through non-combustible means. I've had my coffee this morning. Thank God, no one has come up with an idea of smoking coffee. It would be extremely harmful to get it through the lungs. It's much easier and safer to get it through the digestive tract. And I see Professor Rataemane has just obliged by having a swig. I hope it's coffee, Prof. Rataemane, and not whiskey.
It is. It is coffee.
But you know, it's a stimulant. And the professor, you know, is firing up his brain before he makes his presentation. There are benefits from smoking. There are benefits from nicotine. And maybe the other speakers might talk about demystifying nicotine, how nicotine is misunderstood. The WHO itself has said on countless occasions, nicotine is not carcinogenic. But they then forget and come up with steps. You know, part of the problem is that the tobacco industry has such a bad history. And most health activists have memories that are bigger than the brains of elephants. They do not forget. So in a sense, what we probably need to do for harm reduction to be effective is to ensure that all the other addicts, you know, some people are addicted to fighting the tobacco industry. It's an addiction. And now that there are less harmful alternatives, they carry on with the fight. They will not pause to say, let's listen. Let's look at the evidence. And part of the tragedy of the times we live in is that the best science on this matter comes from the tobacco industry. And it's something that is not different to what happens in pharma. If you look at where we are now with the pandemic, the best science comes from pharmaceutical companies. They are now the ones that have made vaccines available. They are now the ones pushing vaccines. And the only information about safety comes from the people that are the major beneficiaries from selling the vaccines. But we openly engage with them. We openly scrutinize. We have independent authorities. We have SAHPRA in South Africa. There's the FDA and the CDC in the US, where we have independent people that look at the information that comes from the pharmaceutical companies so that we can make informed decisions about how to move forward. But the science is done by the industry itself. Unfortunately, the tobacco situation is no different. The best research comes from the tobacco companies. But we need to enable independent scientists to openly engage with the research that comes from tobacco companies without committing career suicide, as is happening right now. So there are other issues around harm reduction that we need to be mindful of, that we need to engage with, so that this space becomes a safe space, so that those minds can be allowed space to engage with the science that comes from the industry. They are resourced to independently corroborate the evidence that is put on the table so that we can make informed decisions. Now, we need, I go back to where I started. Please, do not decide for me. Give me information so that I can make an informed decision. Please, do not turn my habit into criminal behavior by making the products that can help me banned products. So I now have to behave like a criminal just because I want some nicotine. When you ban this stuff, people have to go to the black market, people have to import. People can be arrested because products have been made illegal. Banning does not help. I will leave you with an example where banning does not help. The previous government in South Africa banned political movements like the ANC, the PAC, and others. Fast track 40 years later, the ANC is in government. So by banning it, all they did, they made it go underground and they made it grow stronger. By banning it, they ensured and woke up people that were sleeping And an anti-apartheid movement was started in the UK post the banning of the ANC. So some things happen that trigger things. Lastly, we live in the George Floyd moment. And the sad thing about that picture of George Floyd is that you saw a white policeman's knee on the neck of a black man. Sadly, in our continent, what happened to George Floyd happens every day. There's only one difference. The knee on our necks is black as well. I'm saying to our governments, let us think, let us not be told what to do. Let us do what other OECD countries do. They look at the advisory from the WHO. They engage their citizens and they make their own regulations that are appropriate for the environments that they are in. Bannings don't work. Lastly, in Africa, we got to look at snus, smokeless tobacco, nicotine pouches, because of their affordability, but also because they are more environment friendly than other non-combustible nicotine alternatives. Let's think about our environment as well. Let's remember that these electronic products create electronic waste. And that might be a challenge going forward. You got cigarette stubs all over. What's going to happen with the electronic pollution? I am not a punter of anyone, but in terms of our ability, what we can afford, access to electricity, the initial investments on devices, we need to ensure that all risk-reduced products are available to all of society, because smoking occurs across the classes, and we need to ensure that the alternative products are affordable to society, and we need to stop our governments from banning them or overtaxing them. Thank you to everyone. I'm looking forward to the engagement discussion time. Thank you, Dilo.
Thank you so much, Kgosi, for a tremendous keynote speech. And just an anecdote to the friends who are online at the moment. If you look at the picture behind Kgosi of Nelson Mandela, Kgosi was asked by Nelson to explain to him the phenomenon of AIDS and how to prevent that. So Kgosi's career has spanned over many decades, and specifically his career in harm reduction, which has been in HIV/AIDS, drugs, alcohol, and tobacco harm reduction, has been a stellar career. And thank you for your contribution, not only in South Africa, but to Africa and the world, Kgosi. And I salute you for the key messages that you've brought, especially in terms of the access and affordability for smokers to reduced risk products. I think here at the end, you made a very important point in terms of these products that need to be used as intended. These products are not for the youth. It's intended for smokers to give them a fire exit. You spoke about the safety of these products and the quality, the product standards, and you spoke about the environmental suitability and all the considerations we need to take into account. And then also that we need to be able to trace these products. So on that note, it's my great privilege to introduce to you Joseph Magero. Joseph is from Kenya. As I've said, he's a long-time tobacco control and tobacco harm reduction advocate. And let's zoom in now on Kenya. Joseph's experiences of tobacco control and harm reduction in Kenya, and then more specifically, the experience of consumers of oral nicotine pouches in Kenya over the last years. Joseph, please, the floor is yours. And may I, Joseph, before you speak, may I just ask, in the chat section on your right-hand side, if you have any questions, please do send it to us, and I'll make sure that either myself or one of the panelists give you as good an answer as we can. Thank you very much. Joseph, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dillon. Good morning, everyone. Like you said, my name is Joseph. I'm chairman of Campaign for Safer Alternatives. We are a nonprofit Pan-African organization with about 7 member organizations. We advocate for safer nicotine products to be made available to smokers looking to quit or shift to less harmful products. Now, just before I go into the oral nicotine report, I would just like to put a disclaimer out that we are not promoting a specific brand or a specific company, for that matter. So nicotine products have been available in Kenya for the past 2.5 years, up until late last year, when due to some misinformation, the product got suspended from the market and has gone underground ever since. Kenya, as you know, has about 2.5 million smokers, with about 8,000 of them dying every year from smoking-related harm. So we sought to find out what the users of nicotine pouches, the behavior study of what they went through, and those that were using the product, how they found it. And we approached Ipsos for a survey report, which I will just share with you briefly using some slides that I have. For a moment. Dylan, I think you need to allow me to share some slides, please. I can't hear you.
It should be, you should be able to share.
So, like I said, Ipsos is an independent market research company, but largest in the world. We commissioned them to do a research for us, and the research was based on oral nicotine users behavior study. It was launched last week, and I'm just briefly going to share with you the findings of the report. So the methodology, they interviewed users from the age of 18 to 44 years old. About 64 users did the survey. And the findings were that oral nicotine pouches were seen as a safer and healthier route away from smoking and could be the key to quitting for good, according to this new research. That's the finding of a survey conducted by Ipsos on behalf of our organization Campaign for Safe Alternatives to measure Kenyans' attitudes to alternative nicotine products and assess the impact the current suspension imposed on the sale of the nicotine pouches has had. Right, so most of the users were worried about the dangers of smoking combustible cigarettes, but were unable or unwilling to quit. And I might just add that cigarettes. So the respondents view pouches as a safer and healthier alternative to cigarettes, and most say they use them as part of their quitting journey. Now, since the suspension of the sales, they have gone back to cigarettes. You can see in the slide that 80% of the respondents smoked less cigarettes thanks to pouches. So they were using pouches as a quitting aid. As you may be aware, Kenya, there's really no incentive or cessation services or products that are offered by government or health facilities. And those that are available are really, really expensive. Most of them cannot afford them, right? So some of what the respondents said that since the suspension of sales, you can see some of them responding, they say that they have gone back to smoking tobacco. But 4 out of 5 say they now smoke fewer cigarettes than before the arrival of pouches in the Kenyan market about 2 years ago. All right. So we see some of the drives that make them say that you health warnings on the packets of pouches and e-cigarettes in the same light as they do the cigarette packs. So what we can see from this survey is that majority of the smokers in Kenya that were using nicotine pouches were using them as a quit aid. It was not, most of them were smokers. 98% of the people that were using the pouches were actual smokers trying to quit or shift to a less harmful product. You can see some of the sentiments saying that they can be used conveniently. They don't have smoke, there is no combustion, they don't have tobacco. They are non-tobacco products. So move ahead. So the respondents, 18 to 24, 13%. Female was 28%. So here the key findings of the Ipsos study. Participants are well aware of the dangers of cigarettes, but they continue to smoke to this day. And most of the users admit that they are addicted to cigarettes and are struggling to quit. Many of them describe nicotine pouches as a perfect alternative to cigarettes and helpful quit to. Now, these are just sentiments that were echoed by the respondents. These are not things we're making up. These are actual people giving actual stories, and they were done by an independent company as well. So 4 out of 5 of the study participants now smoke less than they did before the arrival of nicotine pouches. We cannot say that about other quit aids that are offered in the pharmaceutical stores here in Kenya. This is just a phenomenal finding that, for me, I find very incredible. And I will keep echoing this to our policymakers and stakeholders as well moving forward. So, yeah, many of the participants view pouches as well, way much safer alternative to cigarettes. When they spoke to them, these guys spoke about the prices of the pouches compared to prices of nicotine patches and nicotine gum in Kenya. And the pouches were way cheaper and very affordable. I believe myself that pouches, oral nicotine, basically, including snus and nicotine pouches, is the way forward for Africa, simply because the affordability is a key factor. They are very much more affordable compared to e-cigarettes, which in Kenya, for example, an e-cigarette like the one I'm holding here goes for about 8,000 shillings, and majority of that is just tax. Without the tax, it would have been selling for 1,000 shillings. So tobacco control respondents try to demonize pouches and such products, and the government listens to them and tries to out-tax them. So yeah, this is those were the findings of the Ipsos report. You can find it on our website. We have just made it go live on our website. So if you want to see the full report, you can go on our website, www.saferalternatives.org. Under publications, you will see the oral nicotine users behavior study, and you can click and download, and it will take you straight, and you can view it for yourself. All the information is available for policymakers, for stakeholders, or naysayers as well. People who don't believe that these products are working. So this is what makes us advocate and do what we are doing, because you can see in less than 2 years, most of these people have tried to quit, and pouches clearly helped them quit. So that is the report, and it's like, right. Elon, you there? You're on mute.
Joseph, thank you so much for a riveting discussion of the results of the survey. And thank you for also alerting our panelists and participants that the full survey is available on the CASA website. It will also be on this conference website. Thank you very much, Joseph. We now have the pleasure to welcome Professor Solomon Ratemane as our next speaker. Solly is the chief psychiatrist at the George Mukhari Hospital in South Africa. He's played an enormous role in the health leadership of the country in South Africa. And he's also at a global level been elected as the Secretary General of the World Association of Psychosocial Rehabilitation. It's a big honor to have you with us, Solly, particularly because mental health problems is often the orphan in the public health debate, and where dependence is one of the conditions that is treated by nicotine, almost by self-medication by consumers. We look forward to hear your presentation on mental health and tobacco harm reduction. I have your slides. Would you like me to show your slides, or will you share the screen?
Please load them.
Fine. There we go. Can you?
Yes. Yeah. Good morning, colleagues. This is a very interesting forum and symposium for us. I think the two previous speakers have essentially touched on the key arguments in relation to our attitude towards tobacco and alternative tobacco products, combustible versus non-combustible products. But I think what was very, very important from Dr. Tlhape's presentation is an accident that almost led to the whole hospital burning down in Johannesburg, where preliminary reports suggest that this could have been an accident where a mentally ill patient was smoking. But there are many of those stories where a patient dies in the ward because he was smoking privately and then burned the mattress and so on. But all that means is that there are a number of patients who are mentally ill who smoke. And now this is now outside the normal population. I think this is important in the context of the concerns that, the next slide please, that WHO has. A recognition that 1 in 3 adults are smokers, 1.1 billion smoke tobacco on each day, China being the largest producer and consumer of cigarettes. And these are combustible cigarettes. They inhale the smoke, which may have a number of toxins. There's a concern by WHO that tobacco kills half of its consumers within a lifetime. And there is a clear recognition that people are not addicted to smoke or the toxins, but what they really need in tobacco is nicotine because of the effects that I'll talk about soon. Nicotine addiction is common in general population and in mentally ill patients. But we can talk about coffee, which most of us have had this morning. We can talk about alcohol and other behaviors anyway that are addictive, but don't seem to raise so much concern as smoking. It's important to note from WHO data that nicotine reaches the brain cells within 8 seconds of smoking and thus delivers desired effect, calmness in particular, within minutes. And this then leads us to the next slide, please. Reasons why people smoke. Most people really smoke for pleasure. They are with friends, they learn to smoke and then they get used to it. But amongst the mentally ill patients, there are many people moving around with anxiety disorders, social phobia, feeling of uncertainty in certain situations, not being confident. And to feel at ease and to be part of the group, they smoke. But if there's a day-long activity that they're part of, it means that they have to be smoking periodically at intervals throughout the day. They use cigarettes, particularly nicotine in the cigarettes, to improve concentration and alertness. In patients with depressive disorders, they tend to feel that if they smoke and smoke regularly, they improve their concentration and they generally feel better. And this has to do with the surge of neurotransmitters, which I'll refer to soon. Neurotransmitters such as dopamine, epinephrine, and so on. We find that the schizophrenic patients, although there's no direct link between smoking and schizophrenia, and by this I mean smoking does not cause schizophrenia, nor does schizophrenia cause addiction to smoking. But there's a tendency for unstable schizophrenic patients to smoke more. In absence of cigarettes, they become more restless. And this has to do with dopaminergic surge and other neurotransmitters that are involved in schizophrenia. So when you go to any psychiatric ward, you'll find patients who want to go out and sit in the sun and smoke. And when they do that, they tend to feel better, they're restless, and they're manageable. This is to the extent that in some hospitals, the nurses or the hospital administration would allow rationing of cigarettes for those patients who want to smoke, because it was noticed that some of those patients felt better. And really the active component that makes them feel better when they smoke is the nicotine within the cigarette. Patients with bipolar mood disorder tend to use alcohol if they have to use any substance at all. But those who do use alcohol tend to also smoke, and smoke more frequently, particularly in the unstable state. When they're stable, the drinking and the smoking is less. Nicotine, therefore, is the underlying substance that each smoker seeks for a good feel effect. And I think, therefore, it's important to also remember what Dr. Tlhape said, that there is no evidence that nicotine itself is carcinogenic, but there are products within combustible cigarettes that are toxic and they can cause different types of cancers. Next slide. Nicotine has lots of effects on the brain. If you inhale a tobacco smoke via lungs and bloodstream, and in about 8 to 10 seconds, the nicotine has reached the brain. It triggers a number of chemical reactions. For instance, the temporary feeling of pleasure and calmness. This is very short-lived sensations. Therefore, when you say a person is addicted to smoking, you find that every hour they have to burn a cigarette. So a pack of 20 cigarettes just goes like that for so-called addicted smokers. But some people do not smoke like that. They smoke at reasonable intervals for a good feel effect, particularly if they're in stressful settings or either feeling bored or feeling a little low. The drop in nicotine levels leads to withdrawal and agitation or edginess. So if you take the psychiatric patient in a mental hospital, if they don't get the nicotine, they do actually become edgy. They become unmanageable, even though they might be on medication. That is why some of the big centers, like some hospitals in the UK, have made nicotine available to the patients, but not in the form of raw tobacco that is combustible, but by providing alternative, safer products that are said to be 95% safer than ordinary raw combustible tobacco. And I think this is important because most governments think that it would be a waste of money to invest in looking at alternatives to smoking cigarettes, combustible cigarettes, and providing safe alternatives. Most of the research that goes on has counter research that tends to point at weaknesses, problems with these so-called safer products. They're looking at release of certain metals like copper and so on, but these are minuscule in relation to the number of toxins that are found in cigarettes. So breaking this cycle, particularly among mentally ill patients, is challenging, as quitting has proved to be difficult. Dr. Tlhape has referred to the fact that in some countries, you will hardly hear of a smoking cessation program. There are a number of people who do want to stop smoking. They don't know where to go. The ordinary rehabilitation facilities tend to look at alcohol and hard drugs like marijuana, cocaine, and so on. But you don't find a focus on the smoking cessation. And this is something to think about. Next slide, please. So as you pointed out, within 10 seconds of smoking, what happens is a surge of adrenaline, which is released. This is a fight or flight hormone. And this is an important hormone in the sense that it increases the heart rate, it increases blood pressure, and restricts blood flow to heart muscles. Now, in a sense, you could say this is potentially dangerous, but in a depressed patient, the surge of adrenaline gives them a feeling of getting better. They can at least handle the depression. Nicotine can also inhibit the release of insulin from the pancreas. So it can cause slight hyperglycemia. It can be appetite suppressant. And that is why I find a number of women in particular who are overweight, who smoke, they tend to smoke a lot because they think it helps them with the suppression of appetite. Now, there are pros and cons for that because if they continue to smoke a lot, that may create other problems and not just the suppression of appetite. The other hormone that's important is dopamine. This increases with smoking, it's responsible for feelings of pleasure and well-being. This means regular smoking throughout the day is necessary to maintain the good feeling. Now, what's important to note is that dopamine, adrenaline are the kinds of hormones that are involved in the key mental disorders such as schizophrenia and bipolar mood disorder. So there is something that nicotine does in terms of regulating the surge and the drop in these hormones. So in patients who are restless and so on in the mental hospitals, when they smoke, there is a surge of dopamine to the point where the restlessness decreases. So it's almost like a paradoxical effect, but it is a positive effect for the patients at a given time, recognized by the nurses. Nicotine also activates the same pathways in the brain that drugs such as cocaine, amphetamines do, although to a lesser extent. So what we are hearing, what we're seeing here is that pathways of addictions are similar, but these pathways also tend to overlap with pathways for key mental disorders such as schizophrenia and bipolar mood disorder. Therefore, we have to then see whether there is a point, number one, in denying mentally ill patients any form of use of nicotine. And I'm saying use of nicotine in the sense that we want to protect them from combustible cigarette because of the toxins contained therein, because this can cause other problems. Remember that mentally ill patients are like any other human being. They do have other associated physical problems. They may have cardiovascular problems. They may have diabetes and so on. So you do not want to make those conditions worse by allowing the patients to smoke too much. But if they do smoke and you cannot do anything about it, are there safer alternatives? Dr. Alklape referred to some of the safer alternatives, and I think in the discussion, we can go deeper into some of those safer alternatives, because the idea of those safer alternatives is that they give the person or the patient the basic substance that is required, that they are searching for, which is nicotine, but in a safer form that will not harm them or harm other organs of the body. Next slide, please. So the chemicals, therefore, in cigarettes will be primarily nicotine, but there's tar varying between 7 and 20 milligrams per cigarette. And this has a high risk of causing lung cancer, emphysema, bronchial disorders, and chronic lung diseases. And this is important because if you go to any medical ward in any hospital, the highest rates of admission, particularly in relation to pulmonary disorders, it's amongst patients who smoke a lot. If you look at lung cancers, not every person with lung cancer is a smoker, but the highest number of people with lung cancers have a history of heavy smoking. I think this is an important issue. And this has to do with more than 1,000 toxic chemicals that are found in smoke. Carbon monoxide, for instance, increases the chance of cardiovascular disease. And that is there if you're using combustible cigarettes. But the safer alternatives, which we can go back to in discussion, will provide nicotine in a cleaner form. Therefore, the risk of cardiovascular disease and other chronic disorders is lessened a great deal. We know a lot about second-on smoking today, and that it can cause lung cancer in both smoking and non-smoking adults, and it increases the risk of respiratory illness in children, and also sudden infant death. A number of mothers would say, I don't know what happened, but my baby just died. But when you take a history, you find that within that household, there are many people who smoke, or the mother herself smokes a lot. And there has been a lot of secondary smoking that affected the infant. Question is it easy to quit? Maybe no, unless there are specific programs that target smoking to assist people to stop smoking. Now, this is a very difficult dilemma to deal with, because some people smoke for pleasure. They don't want to totally stop, but they want to continue smoking, but they don't want to become sick from smoking. What do we offer those people? Are there alternatives that you can give them such that they can continue smoking, but without too much harm to their health? So the quit program and the support programs for quitting smoking are not easy to find. And where they exist, there's still a lot of research to see which programs are effective. These are programs based on attitudes, behavioral, understanding of smoking. This may include, quit aids such as nicotine patches, e-cigarettes, and other safer products that we'll discuss. I think it's very, very important to know that the dilemma of dealing with tobacco and safer alternatives, it's a problematic one, because many governments, we know in Africa, some of the countries, the greatest revenue comes from tobacco sales and so on, and also tobacco taxes. So governments are at the difficult position in terms of making a decision as to what to allow. The assumption is that if they accept and allow safer products to get into the market, they might lose revenue from combustible cigarettes. And then some governments respond also by wanting to tax, the safer products that deliver nicotine in a cleaner form, the same way as combustible ordinary cigarette. That's a discussion you should have, because if a product is aimed at improving someone's health, protecting a person from becoming ill or progressively ill or very ill, that product should be viewed differently. So the regulatory processes have to also look at the science behind what is happening, because this is harm reduction. If you reduce harm by giving medications for diabetes, for all sorts of things, HIV, AIDS, and so on, you're not necessarily stopping everything, but you are making sure that people are able to live decent, healthier lives, even though they still have the disease. So why do we look at alternative products to cigarettes differently? Why are we not accepting that they are part of the armamentarium for harm reduction? Let me stop here and hope that we can take up some of these issues in discussion. Thank you.
Prof. Ratemane, thank you very much indeed for that insight into the psychological and social aspects of tobacco harm reduction. And on this point, it's my great privilege to introduce to the participants and our worldwide audience, Professor Carl Fagerstrom. Now in medicine, we often use the Fagerstrom cigarette dependence test. He is the inventor of this test, and he's had a lifelong experience in the research and development of nicotine alternatives to combustible tobacco. Carl, thank you very much for joining us. And from all your friends and fans, it's an absolute joy to have you with us as almost as the father of nicotine and nicotine reduced risk products. If I may ask your comments on Sweden and also your impressions on tobacco harm reduction worldwide. You've been involved in both nicotine replacement therapy, medicinal nicotine replacement therapy, and then the more recreationally used nicotine alternatives. What are the one or two lessons that Africa can learn from Sweden in terms of oral nicotine and its use in reducing the risk of tobacco?
Thank you very much, Dilon, for inviting me to this conference, and thanks to the previous speakers that have given insightful information that I have learned a lot, and the study carried out in Kenya was very interesting to take part in. So the question to me, what can we learn from Sweden's tobacco harm reduction? The question is that it does work, and I will prove that harm reduction works. I will try to show you some slides here. Can you see the slides now?
Yes, we can.
So what we see here, that is how tobacco consumption in Sweden has been for the last 100 years. This is 1916. Cigarette smoking was not very much in fashion at that time. The predominant mode of using tobacco was snus. But cigarette increased, as we know, in most countries, all the way up to about 1970s, when we started to know that smoking is certainly not very healthy, but very harmful. And then at the same time, the little remaining snus habit started to grow. And now you can see that the snus has overtaken cigarettes, so there is much more snus products used than, than cigarettes, and particularly so among men. And if we go to the next slide here, see, I cannot move.
If you click on your left-hand side on the slide, then it works.
I must, right, yes, it does. So here we are. So what is the daily tobacco or nicotine use in Sweden today? If we look at the men, there is only 4% men smoking. So this end game that many countries have set as a goal is to have fewer than 5% of the population smoking. That has happened with the Swedish men. But instead they are using snus, 20% about or so, and just 1% e-cigarettes. That means that 25% of Swedish men are using tobacco, which is fairly average to what is happening in the whole European Union among men. So 4% are smoking, 20% are using snus. If we then go to the next picture, which is a very important picture because it tells us about the death rates attributable to tobacco. And this is data from the WHO Global Report on Mortality attributable to tobacco. And we see the European Union member states other than Sweden, the median, the country with the most deaths, in this case in lung cancer, and the country with the least. And the median is 220 per deaths per 100,000. The country with the least, 91, but Sweden has even lower, 87. If we go to oral cancer, since many think that snus applied to the oral cavity is causing oral cancer, we see that Sweden has lower mortality to oral cancer, much lower than the average, and lower also than the second lowest in the European Union. Cardiovascular, very much the same, much lower than the second lowest. And if we go to all causes, it is 550, the average in the European Union, while it's just 222 in Sweden, and the highest 1,300. So this actually tells us that we have very low tobacco attributable mortality in Sweden, and the snus must play a part here because we use as much nicotine as anyone else in the European Union, but we have another picture in mortality. If we were to look at women, we would see that Swedish women is actually higher than the EU average on lung cancer, the same on oral cancer, 17 is higher than 10. all causes 173, much higher than 115. The Swedish women has not taken on to snus. They have been smoking to a larger extent. So there is a kind of an experiment within Sweden here, where men has much lower than women, and what differs between them is actually the tobacco habit, using snus or not. I would also like to remind you that in the United States, the Federal Food and Drug Administration, they have control over tobacco products, and in that law they can also assign an order to certain products that they are less harmful than other products. And Swedish snus was the first product by FDA to be recognized as less harmful. And the text is here, we don't need to go in detail to that. I would go to the very big global, regional and national comparative risk assessment study. 84 behavioral and environmental risks were looked at. And they conclude that there is sufficient evidence that chewing tobacco and other products have a toxicity, excess risk, and cause excess risk of oral and oesophageal cancer, while at this time existing evidence does not support attributed such a burden to snus and similar products.
Sorry, Carl. Joseph, if you could just mute your speaker. Apologies, Carl.
Okay.
Could I just ask all to just mute their
Okay. Thank you.
And finally, regarding the discussion, what's the role of nicotine, how harmful is nicotine? I like to finish with a quote from the former FDA Commissioner Steve Gottlieb that said, "Nicotine, while highly addictive, is delivered through products on a continuum of risk, and that in order to successfully address cigarette addiction, we must make it possible for current adult smokers who still seek nicotine to get it from alternative and less harmful sources." And that's exactly what we are talking about today. In the intro to my little input here, Dilon mentioned also that I've been part of developing the nicotine replacement products. And certainly that is true. And they have contributed, of course, to many people as enabled them to give up smoking. But it hasn't really been a very, very great success because they are too medicalized. They have a nicotine uptake profile, which is not good enough for most smokers. They are too expensive. They are not available everywhere. So therefore, we need other products. And we can see that when the e-cigarettes were introduced, they became very, very popular because it's closer to what the smoker wants in terms of nicotine uptake, but also in terms of the behavior. So I think the new oral, non-tobacco oral nicotine pouches, as well as e-cigarettes, they have a role to play in order to reduce the mortality and morbidity in the same way that Sweden has been lucky to do. Thank you very much.
Terrific, Carl. Thank you so much for giving us the Swedish experience. If I could ask you to stop sharing, and then we will now move into a panel discussion. I just want to ask Corsi to show his handsome visage, and then we will move into a question and answer and a panel discussion. There are a few questions that have already been asked by our participants, and thank you very much for that. The first question I'd like to pose to the panelists is on the World Health Organization and other stakeholders who seem to be, I want to put it diplomatically, but they are very negative about tobacco harm reduction, and they claim that there's not enough research or evidence to show that products like the oral nicotine pouches help with smoking cessation. I can almost compare it to what's happening with COVID, where there's a big debate about the vaccine, and you have two groups. You have the public health group promoting and advancing the use of vaccines, and then you have the so-called anti-vaxxers, where anti-vaxxers are saying that vaccines are not safe. There's not enough evidence to prove that they can deter the virus. And it brings a great deal of confusion to both consumers and patients. My question to all of you, are we not facing exactly the same problem in tobacco harm reduction? That the anti-tobacco harm reduction group is almost like the anti-vaxxers. Your comments, please. Jose, I know you addressed this question on the WHO. Any thoughts on the WHO's role and why they seem to be so negative?
I think that in terms of the example that you make, the difference is that vaccines are not banned. And we can have open engagement across the sides. Right. And everybody can talk to everybody. There's no limitation of communication that this group you can't speak to. If you associate with this group, you become ostracized. And at the end of the day, it's left to the individual citizen to either have the vaccine or not have the vaccine. So, and that's what we should also be advocating for, that things should not be banned. There should be open discussion. People should not be ostracized because of the opinion they hold. And at the end, we should put the signs in front so that people can make informed decisions based on evidence. And that's the similarity that we have, that should be made. So the WHO should also be consistent, because on everything they ask for evidence. You know, when there was an issue of clotting in AstraZeneca, they said, don't hurry. Look at the evidence, look at the, you know, the risk versus the benefit. Do that analysis and then make a decision based on that. Nobody said, you know, the vaccine is a gateway to clotting when you look at the numbers. So there's an inconsistency in terms of how they deal with other matters and in terms of how they deal with tobacco. And I think it goes to the issue of, you know, people became world authorities on being anti-tobacco and anti the industry. When there are alternatives, if you don't convert, you get left behind. You know, product movement has not occurred for them. You know, if you stayed with film and you're still producing film, you'd be out of business. And that's the problem. There's no conversion. But I think they have pressures of who funds them. It's about their funding model, and it's also about belief systems. And if you look at what has happened around medical education, we were taught about nicotine and cigarette smoking like we were in a theology class, not even in a class, like we were congregants. And there was a pastor at the pulpit who was the only one looking at the information and making pronouncements to us. And we need to get out of that mode. And I think the critical thing is that at this point in time, the WHO should be informed that their article on not communicating with tobacco industry is archaic and it's anti-progress and belongs in a museum.
Thank you for that, Jose. A question to you, Joseph. Is it right then to say, and this is from Joel Sava, I think from Kenya, is it right to say that in Africa, the biggest hindrance to tobacco harm reduction is in fact tobacco control? Would you concur with that? Your comments, please.
Wait, repeat the question again. You said tobacco control.
Is it right to say that in Africa, the biggest hindrance, the biggest obstruction to tobacco harm reduction is tobacco control?
Well, I am in tobacco control still, so I would say it is the people that fund tobacco control in Africa. This is simply because they have a set of rules that you cannot embrace harm reduction if you expect them to fund you. So I would say they are the major hindrance, because government stakeholders are willing to listen. we endorse harm reduction when it comes to production and everything and drugs, but when it comes to tobacco, for some reason, simply because we are funded by one entity, then nobody wants to listen to you. So I would say to some extent, yes, it is tobacco control.
That's a very diplomatic answer, Joseph. Thank you. Could I ask our expert psychiatrist and psychologist, Carl and Solomon, there's a question here about how addictive is nicotine? And if I could phrase the question in this way, is there a difference between addiction and dependence? And is the term addiction not being misapplied to, for instance, oral nicotine and even electronic cigarettes?
Carl, please go ahead.
Carl, you're just on mute, Carl.
Yes. So if I go first, then there is a continuum of harm. There is also a continuum of dependence. For example, a nicotine patch has a very, very low dependence potential, near to zero. I have not heard of any using nicotine patches long term or having difficulties coming off nicotine patches. So the nicotine by itself may not necessarily be very dependence producing. I can also give you some data that if we take overnight abstinent smokers, we take them into the lab and they are in withdrawal and they can select between non-nicotine cigarette that gives them no nicotine, or a chewing gum that gives them nicotine. Around 70 to 80% will choose the non-containing cigarette rather than the nicotine-containing gum. And they have had to test the products before, so they know the gum, they know the cigarette. And this is because smokers are not only dependent on the drug, the chemical, but very much also on the object itself, the cigarette, and the behavior that goes with the cigarette smoking. And of course, in a way, our brains are working so that they can't really be dependent on a chemical that they have never seen, they have never sensed, they have never touched. It's through an object that they get the chemical. So that was a long intro, but that means we do have data to prove that smokeless tobacco, although dependence producing, is less so than cigarettes. E-cigarettes are also a bit less dependence producing than traditional cigarettes. And nicotine replacement formulations are further less dependence producing. And if we talk about the latest product, the oral pouches, I suppose that they might have some dependence potential, but they might probably be clearly less dependent producing than cigarette, and probably also less dependent than the traditional smokeless tobacco products, because within tobacco, nicotine is the major alkaloid, but there are a number of other alkaloids there also that can contribute to the dependence. So from a dependence point of view, this is a product that is better than the traditional cigarettes for sure.
Thank you, Carl. Prof. Ratemane.
Yes, I think, there is dependence and there is addiction. And anecdotally, you look at certain behaviors. For instance, when people get out of the airplane, as soon as they grab their bags, before they work out their transport home, they dash out to a place where they must smoke. And you look at restaurants where it's clearly stated you should not smoke, but a person will fight and want to smoke in there. They'll smoke in the bedroom, and make other people uncomfortable. You are told don't smoke in the house. So there is some degree of dependence, there's some degree of addiction. Not talking about mentally ill patients who are in hospital. You take people with anxiety disorders, depression, and so on. If those people do not address the anxiety and depression with psychotherapeutic techniques, with relevant medications and so on, there is a tendency to smoke more, and that leads to addiction or dependence. So it can be a problem. And that is why for some of those people who cannot actually contain themselves, who want to smoke every half an hour, every hour, and so on, that we should be looking at safer alternatives. I think that's a key issue about harm reduction, that there will be a cohort of people who will not want to stop, but who may want to, who will feel safe and comfortable, to be smoking, even if it's not hourly, but at reasonable intervals.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Prof. Rataimane. A question to Khosi and Joseph from Nigeria. Carl from Uche Olatunji. Can nicotine pouches cause cancer? And considering the large population in Nigeria and the number of smokers in Nigeria, would you recommend oral nicotine pouches to smokers in Nigeria? Khosi or Joseph, your views, please.
So he's asking if nicotine pouches cause cancer.
Yes.
Well, first of all, the pouches, they don't contain any tobacco. And as we all have heard, nicotine is not carcinogenic. So I wouldn't say they would cause cancer. They have the same level of nicotine as patches and the gum, which is between 4 milligrams to 6 milligrams. And you have not had WHO saying that patches cause cancer.
Right.
I would place them in the same category.
Joseph, and then the question whether you would recommend Nigeria. Sorry, Khos.
On the issue of Nigeria, I think we should not fall into the trap of finding a specific solution for a population. We should make all products, all reduced risk products available. Because as Carl said, people get different things from smoking. For someone for whom the ritual is important, an electronic cigarette or a heat-not-burn product still retains the ritual of putting something in your mouth and blowing something out. They may find that's more suitable for them. For someone else where it's chemical dependence, they may be okay with a pouch in their mouth, whether it's nicotine or not. So what we should not get into is to try and say, in Africa, this is the solution. These are consumer products, and we should make them all available. And we should also be open to any future products that can become available, as long as we understand the issue of combustion and non-combustion. But I had a question to the two mental experts on addiction and dependence. I had my own saying, to try and understand it. A nymphomaniac is addicted. A prostitute is dependent. So I just want to hear from the mental health experts what their comments would be on those statements.
Yeah, Jose, you're pushing us too far now, because you must define what nymphomania is before we can move forward. But I think these are not similar issues, essentially. And some of those things are hidden, they don't affect anybody. I'm not so sure the secondary nymphomania, the secondary prostitution. But here we have second-hand smoking that affects other people, that affects children, and so on, that can cause illness in other people who are not using cigarettes, but they inhale the smoke from a person who's smoking nearby. But we don't have the same pleasure from prostitutes, even if you're just standing next to them or the nymphomaniacs. So that doesn't really relate too well.
Thank you for that diplomatic dance around the question. Carl, please.
Just a little injection into the question about cancer. At least as these new pouches are formulated in Europe, and I hope you have the same kind of product in Africa, the ingredients are food grade, so they are generally allowed in food. And there might be some flavoring there that may not have been in foods before. So the ingredients apart from nicotine should not be a problem. With smokeless tobacco, you have other ingredients also that could, for example, potentially form nitrosamines. And WHO, via its agency IARC, has not declared nicotine to be cancerogenic. So I think with all we know, these very pure products, which are almost identical, apart from the different flavorings, almost identical to the nicotine replacement products, which are on the WHO's essential list, there is a remote possibility that it would cause cancer.
I would like to repeat what Carl just said. He mentioned the organization called IARC. This is the International Agency for the Research in Cancer. It's a sub-agency of the World Health Organization, and it's located in Lyon, France. And nicotine is one of the chemicals that have been considered by IARC, whether it poses any carcinogenic or cancer potential to its consumers. And as Carl rightly says, there's no evidence of that. And in fact, the nicotine in nicotine replacement therapy is on the WHO list of essential medicines and has been sold for 40 years in the pharmaceutical sector. Thank you very much for that. Carl, I have another question from you, from Joel Sava, in view of your slides. What time frame would you give Africa's recovery for the impacts of combustible cigarettes in terms of mortalities and disease if oral nicotine were to be taken up on the continent? So if, for instance, Africa followed the Swedish example, and where now there's a smoking prevalence of 14% in Africa, continent-wide, and if we were able to reduce and switch to oral nicotine and push the smoking prevalence down to 4%, such as in Sweden, what impact would that have on morbidity and mortality?
It would have an immediate effect. Usually when we talk about tobacco control and want to end smoking, we are putting all our eggs in the basket of not having adolescents to start smoking. That is, of course, a good thing, and it would pay off eventually. But it would take 20, 30, maybe 40 years to really see an effect if that would be the only activity we had, where we really can harvest rapid, good harvest, that if we can get the smokers to quit, you would immediately see in a couple of years that there would be less cancer, there would be less COPD, less cardiovascular, etc. The full effect would take, again, as with stopping the kids, some 30, 40 years, but you would see an effect immediately in a couple of years.
Thank you very much. José, there's a question from Atakan Befrit, who's been a really effective consumer advocate over many years, and he's fought a tireless war, and thank you for that, Atakan. The question is to you and to Joseph, that if products are banned, and José, you spoke to this in your keynote, but if products are banned, it tends to go underground. And the question is, who supplies the underground market, especially in Kenya? So if these products are banned, as oral nicotine pouches were banned just in the recent months, what effect did that have in Kenya? How large was the underground market, and who supplied this? Joseph, maybe you first, and then José can add his point.
Well, just a point of correction, the product was not banned, it was suspended. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so about the underground, we get products like e-cigarettes and snus, which is not illegal in Kenya. E-cigarettes are not illegal in Kenya. Nicotine pouches were suspended, but we still have them available. I am not sure about who supplies the product, but I just know that if you go to some areas in downtown and you're looking for pouches, you're able to get them. However, they have become a bit more expensive because of the government stance. So I'm not really sure who supplies this black market.
Thank you. José, you spoke passionately about the fact that Government should give information and not ban. What is your view on banning of products in Africa specifically?
Well, the only experience we have is in relation to COVID. We were one of the few markets that banned cigarettes. And we saw
And vaping
that,
products, and vaping products?
yes, cigarettes and vaping products. And what we saw was that there was loss of tax revenue for the fiscus. There might have been a slight dip in the prevalence of smoking, but it rebounded very quickly. A few people may have quit and they've all gone back. But the main impact was the fact that the illicit market took over. So what happened was that there might have been a slight scarcity, but the illicit market reorganized to occupy the space and they increased their prices. Remember, the illicit market always undercut the taxed product because they don't have tax. So they're much cheaper. But during this period of banning, they upped their prices because they were the only show in town. So it became inflationary. And the tobacco industry reports having lost up to a third of their market to the illicit market that even post the ban has not recovered. So that would be the impact of banning of products. So there might be a slight, disturbance, but people regroup. And what you see in other countries where stuff are banned, the internet is there. People then order on the internet. People then do importations of illegal products and they are not declared. So what you are doing is you are feeding the black market. You are feeding the underground market. Any product, when you do that, you are feeding the underground market, particularly when you have no campaigns to educate and inform.
Right. Okay. I have a question here concerning the United Kingdom. So just to give context, Carl spoke on Sweden. In the United Kingdom, with a population of roughly 60 million people and who had 10 million smokers of cigarettes up to 10 years ago, now has a smoking prevalence which has gone way down to about 12%, and there are about 4 million users of vaping products. Part of the success of the decrease in smoking prevalence seems to have been that the country's government has embraced tobacco harm reduction officially in its public health policy, and it's gone as far as to financially support the payment of registered and regulated vaping products. Can the UK example be applied in Africa, and how? Any of the panelists can answer.
I think what you need to understand is that the UK has a national health system. And they were offering cessation access to all their citizens. And they have cessation clinics all over Britain. And what they have done, they were providing NRTs there, psychological therapy, and all the other support therapy. But they've seen that when you add e-cigarettes to that suite of access to care, they have better results. So you can't introduce them into a vacuum. When you have a system where your health system does not even pay for NRT, you're going to have a problem trying to substitute NRT with e-cigarettes or other alternatives that might increase the success of cessation. So what we need to do in Africa is to work on our health systems, ensure that people have access to care. Remember, there's still this issue of quitting. But even in our environment where we have 15% of the population on health insurance called medical aid, the insurance doesn't pay for cessation, for smoking. You are on your own. And we have to make that as a part of the care that is provided by the health system before we even have a chance of being able to introduce e-cigarettes or other risk-reduced products into the system. And for Africa, because we don't pay, let's encourage their availability. Let's put them in the market so that let's make them affordable. Let's avoid the heavy tax regime inform the public so that they can easily access affordable, risk-reduced alternatives to combustible cigarettes.
On that note, Khosi, thank you for that. To Solomon and to Carl, Brian Watts from the UK asked the question, in the UK, e-cigarettes are used in mental health facilities instead of allowing smoking. It is working, and it's working well for almost all types of pathology or illnesses in the facilities. Again, is that something that could be copied or applied in an African context or even in a Swedish context, Carl?
But before Carl comes in, because he'll give a longer answer, you know, Khosi talked about WHO asking for evidence. If we're going to produce evidence, we have to try it out on a few sites. We have to try something before we just take it off and criticize it. The UK experience is very interesting because at those hospitals where the alternative products are offered, they've seen better management of patients. And all I can say is that in our setting, in several or various African hospitals, we should at least try and see what the effects would be, whether that, number one, there'd be improvement in general physical health of these patients, and secondly, whether their mental health issues would be better managed. Thank you.
Thank you, Solomon. Carl.
Long ago, I think there was not much of a social gradient in terms of smoking or not. But as smoking prevalence is pushed and pressed down by various activities, those who have it more easily to give up are the ones that can give up, and the remainders are more dependent, have a worse life in terms of mental diseases, pleasure, resources in general. And certainly when one gets down to the low smoking rates, like in Sweden, 4%, almost, no, I shouldn't say everyone, but very many of these 4%, certainly more than half of them, have a psychiatric comorbidity. And this is why I think it will be very hard to wipe nicotine out from the earth as it is with other drugs, because some have, there are two things. Some may have use for nicotine, and others may have a comorbidity that makes it so difficult for them to stop. And for some, there is a union of both comorbidity and lack of resources, etc., to stop. So there will always be some people to use this drug, and then it has to be used in the best format, the least harmful format. And while we are talking here, it's just dawned on me that COVID is, of course, the thing now, and people are dying and dying and dying, and we are scared. Do more people die from COVID than from smoking per year?
Precisely.
Certainly not so far. Up
Yes.
to now, a little more than a year, less in the entire world have died from COVID than from smoking.
Well, I think you touch on a very important point, and that of relative risk and relative mortalities. And I'd like to just return to the oral nicotine survey that Joseph discussed, and the perception of risk by the consumer, and then also how relative risk is handled by the regulators. Joseph, just from your point of view, there seemed to be a great difference between the perception of risk of combustible tobacco. It's as if smokers knew exactly that this is a high-risk lifestyle activity. But for oral nicotine, it seemed to be very low. They seem to think that this is relatively safe. Do you have, from your experience, a reason why this difference in risk perception?
I mean, it's simply because the product does not contain tobacco first, and there is no combustion. So they get the same sensation they get from smoking, and that word spreads a lot, because most, if not all, of the respondents who said something similar to that.
I think that was also the key point Kgosi made in his keynote, the difference between combustion and non-combustion. And Kgosi, there's a question here from Uganda, which says that vaping products, this is Joel Sava from Kampala, Uganda. In my country, vaping products are banned. Why is the World Health Organization so adamant to not to adopt tobacco harm reduction with all the evidence available? And what can be done about that?
I think one of the problems for Uganda is that the tobacco control unit for Africa is based in Uganda. So they will be anti-tobacco and they'll have the ear of government and they will lobby strongly without evidence. Remember, lobbying is about how close you are to those that control the levers of power. It's not whether you make sense or whether there's a scientific basis for that. And there's also the issue of morality, thou shalt not, that prevails in the psyche of Africa and has been demonstrated in Uganda as well, where people need to be controlled. People, there's the line between evil and good. This is a sin and that type of thing. And the only way we can deal with these things is by educating, advocating, and putting the information out there. And all of us should inform ourselves of the science that is out there, look at the studies that are being done out there, and be able to make those available to our governments. We also need to get into a point where laws and policies have to be evidence-based. In South Africa, we're fortunate that you even have to do a socio-economic impact analysis before any decision can be made. So if we adopt those issues throughout Africa, it'll give people that you should hear the people before you ban. You can't come up with a decision where there's no engagement of the communities. I mean, we got to stand up and our authorities have to stop treating us like we're part of a congregation. They have to treat us as citizens and they must engage us. And we must be able to be given space to think about these things and give our own responses and give our own comments on these issues.
Just on that, there's a question from Andrew Thompson, and he speaks about the elephant in the room regarding WHO, and that's the Bloomberg billions. So it is curious that Michael Bloomberg, a white billionaire from the States, has such a tremendous influence on not only the WHO agenda, but especially in Africa. Now, much of the work is laudable. If you take, for instance, the Gates Foundation's work in malaria in Africa has made a tremendous contribution to public health. It's prevented disease and it's prevented premature mortality. But if you look at the millions that Bloomberg has spent just against vaping products, just last year alone, I think there was $160 million invested in attacking vaping products. The question is whether this is appropriate and whether it is in the best interest of preventing disease and preventing premature tobacco-related mortality. What are your views on the Bloomberg millions being infused into the anti-tobacco harm reduction camp?
I'll just say briefly that I had a conversation with the head of tobacco control here in Africa. He's based in South Africa. And up to date, he still doesn't understand that nicotine is not what causes the major harm in smoking. So what has happened with these people is that whatever they're told to say, they say, and they don't even think for themselves, which is pretty sad. If you question the science and you question the evidence, they automatically shut you up. So I think the factor of just money is what has brought a problem here, because in countries in Europe and America, people think, scientists think for themselves. But if you pay a policymaker or you fund a policy movement without looking at the science, then you get what we have here, which is just a total mess.
Okay. Any other views? I have an interesting question on TV as well.
Yeah, I think it's all about money. It's about funding. And I think the unfortunate thing for the WHO is their funding model makes them susceptible to who funds them. You saw what happened when the US said we're not going to pay. And the people that give money will give money on conditions. It's not unconditional money. Bloomberg funds you if you're going to promote his ideas. He's not funding you and you decide because you are the expert on it. So basically, you are a Bloomberg front. You're not expected to think, you're expected, he funds a particular ideology. He's not funding a cause, he's funding his own ideology. And we've seen it, and you hear it all the time. You know, scientists don't want to do the right thing. They don't want to speak up because the funding might dry up. You know, the NIH might take away the money if I don't say what they want me to say. So as Joseph says, it's about the money. And until we have money that is given to people to do science, no attachments, with no outcome, we're not funding an outcome, we are funding research, then that will be decent money that you get. But Bloomberg money, you sing for your supper.
Well, let's pivot to a very important question to Africa, which is TB. Derek Yach, who played a major role in the development of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control and has made a massive contribution to tobacco harm reduction, asked the question that most patients with TB smoke. Are there any examples of addressing this while thousands are on TB treatment? Now, we know that in the world, there are about 10 million cases of TB, and a high percentage of these patients smoke. Can tobacco harm reduction and the products of tobacco harm reduction help these patients while they are on treatment?
Dylan, I was just going to say that I think Derek, brings up a very important issue. And this supports my notion that we should not be impatient as harm reduction specialists. We should identify areas where we can do work that will convince government that harm reduction works. You go to TB hospitals, you find patients smoking tobacco, rolled in brown paper, coughing horribly, painfully, and yet they are supposed to be on medication. Many of the patients with chronic TB, particularly men, have been heavy smokers. If you visit internal medicine wards where there are patients with chronic lung diseases, emphysema and so on, and we do a research on the history of smoking and so on, you'll find that there's a high percentage of people who've been smoking. If we were able to intervene by promoting safe alternatives, perhaps these little bits of pressure can convince governments that there's something to say about harm reduction, tobacco harm reduction. But what Derek is bringing up is a very, very important issue. Let me hear what Joseph and Jose would want to say.
Well, all I can add, Sol, is that if we look at the work that has been done by Ricardo Polosa and colleagues on making available electronic cigarettes and lately heat-not-burn products to patients with chronic obstructive airways disease, they've seen and they've documented clear symptomatic improvement amongst the patients that were given the risk-reduced products. There's scientific evidence of symptomatic relief. So at a minimum, Derek, the patients would be much better if they were switched to risk-reduced products based on scientific studies that were done in the university in Italy under Ricardo Polosa and friends. So the answer is yes. But the challenge we have is resources. So for me, it would be about providing the information and making the products available at minimum cost so that the patients could buy them for themselves. As Soli says, they are smoking. They are not being given those smokes by government. They are buying them themselves. So if you gave them an alternative product that was less harmful, that was affordable, that would be the way to go. Our health systems can't even provide basic proven therapies to patients. And what we should be advocating for is proper education of smokers and seriously making sure that the reduced risk products are dead cheap and affordable. to patients.
Thank you, Josi. We have a question from Kurt Yeo, who is a consumer advocate. And his question is, my biggest concern is the loss of faith in the medical and research fraternity based on the misrepresentation and conflation seen around tobacco harm reduction. Carl, I know you've been a tireless advocate for regulation, especially in the European Union, to be based on solid science. You want evidence-based policy. In particular, you've been advocating for the recognition of a relative risk of the different types of products, and then an accurate risk communication of those various categories. I know from my days in tobacco control, we tried to avoid that. We wanted to say that all tobacco kills, and we wanted to conflate that for policy biased reasons. So my question first to you, and then I'd like to turn to Joseph. How can we build trust again in the evidence and the researches of relative risk of the different products, and how can that be communicated?
You are giving me a very hard task here, but at least I hear you mention the word trust, and I have become a little bit pessimistic when it comes to we need more research. I have seen on things studies enough to make a good judgment, but that good judgment is not made simply because the two armies here, they don't trust each other. So there need to be trust built on both sides, I suppose. And to build trust, it's easier said than done. I do not have a recipe for it, but I think we have to be less extreme. I mean, sometimes when the other side is so strange and particular, we go to an extreme to condemn them and use words that are not helping the case. It sometimes you think about the American political situation with very little cooperation, but trust needs to be built. I don't know how. Trust rather than research. We have research enough to be able to act.
Right. I think that's a great answer. We often talk about the gaps in evidence, and actually there's more evidence than gaps. Josi, please.
Dylan, I think one of the things that we probably need to rule against is people will come up with a study and not look at the evidence and start, in my opinion. And then they will come up with conclusions that are contrary to the evidence. So we need to ensure that we move away from, in my opinion, and maybe we should learn from the legal system. Let's speak to the evidence. Let's stop talking to beliefs and opinions.
Yes.
Those do not belong in science. And we need to get back to what does the evidence say? You know, EVALI, things were said that were not based on the evidence until too late. So we need to ensure that we come back to the basics. So it's not about which side are you on. You know, research is like the politics in the US. Are you a Republican or a Democrat? And truth can never be told. We need to come back to the point where it's about the evidence. It's not about which side you are on.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Josi. And in the last 2 minutes, I think it's appropriate that we, as a panel, thank Joseph Magero and the Campaign for Safe Alternatives in Kenya for being our host today. And the question that I have from an attendee is, from an advocacy point of view, what would be the most effective way to engage African governments and stakeholders in a bid to give oral nicotine and tobacco harm reduction in general the attention and the policy space that it deserves? Joseph, how would you, if you were the architect for oral nicotine regulation and use in Africa, what would you suggest we do?
First, I think going by the report we've had today is to amplify the voices of the users and people who have actual real life stories, people who have smoked and have stop smoking thanks to products such as the oral nicotine pouches. I think that will really help a lot because we already have, just as Carl has said, we have all the evidence on the table, but amplifying voices of people who have switched to these products and have quit smoking thanks to them, I think that will really help in terms of pushing policy.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. We're right on the hour, and I'd just like to thank on behalf of all the participants from all
Before you thank, Dylan,
Yes,
what I'll say
Rossi.
to African governments is we must just live within our means, and we must use our brains. We must stop being catered to by those that fund us. We must act as equal human beings with brains, and we must use them.
We couldn't have ended with a better call to action. Thank you for that, Jose. Just a few comments on how we will make sure that the clips in these videos, the survey, and any other material from this forum will be distributed on this website, on the CASA website. There is a website called tobaccoharmreduction.net that will also house some of this resources. And the idea is that the resources are free. And the request to all those that use them is that please criticize the scientific content. And if you have better ideas and better science, please come with that so that we can have an honest debate about tobacco harm reduction and the evidence base that we need that to eventually move towards evidence-based policy. We'd like to thank all of our speakers. We'd like to thank Kenya for acting as host. We will do this forum again, but we will also be watching closely what's happening to oral nicotine pouches in Kenya, how it displaces smoking prevalence, and how it helps to prevent disease and tobacco-related premature mortality. We thank you very much for your contribution, and we greet you with the words of Jose. Let's use our brains, and let's use tobacco harm reduction wisely to help save lives. Thank you very much for joining. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you to all the panelists and the
Thank you.
participants.
All right.
We don't want to go.
No. Hey, Solly, thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, thank you. I
hope that we can transmit this message, make sure that it's amplified. Thanks, Jose.
Yeah, a follow-up webinar would help.
I hope you don't feel you chose the wrong keynote speaker. Maybe you'll do better.
Never. Never. Never.
I think
Joseph.
it might be a wrong choice because in my next life I was hoping to be a politician. Now, if he says politicians don't have brains or don't use the brains, then I can't go there.
No, I thought it was an excellent session, and we'll make sure that the messages are sent as far and wide as possible. Joseph is a fantastic partner in our journey.
Right.
No, thanks, Dylan. We'll be in touch then.
Thank you. We'll be in touch.
Thank you.
And
I'll close.
in the next 2 months, we will do a South African generated session.
Yes.
And we'll ensure that Joseph
We'll
is
do an
invited
ARA one.
and Africa participates.
That would be great.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank
Thank you so
very
much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
All right.